This episode of the BeanCast is brought to you by Rev. Fast, accurate transcription delivered in less than 12 hours. Find out more and get $10 off your first order at rev.com/blog/beancast. Bandwidth provided by Recursive Squirrel Interactive. Visit them on the web at recursivesquirrel.com. Episode 542, Just Another Holding Company. For Monday, May 6, 2019, it's time for this week's edition of the BeanCast, a weekly discussion about the news and issues facing marketers today. I'm your host, Bob Norp. Thanks for joining us. We've covered many stories on the show about the often challenging working conditions of agency life. Now, two industry advocacy groups are stepping in, trying to raise awareness about mental health issues in the business. Will it work? Tonight, we'll discuss. Also, the growing role of alternative agency networks, whether consumers find brands inspirational again, the evolution of intelligent tracking prevention, plus this week's Ad Fail 5. That's the lineup. Let's meet tonight's panel. Thanks for joining us for this week's BeanCast. I'm Bob Norp, and with me on the panel for this evening, we start with the founder of strategy consultancy, The Difference Engine, Ms. Farrah Bostic. Farrah, hi, how are you?
Good, Bob. It's nice to be back.
It's great to have you here. Now, next up, joining us, we have a prolific blogger, podcaster, speaker, author, and the founder of the 6 Pixels Group, among other things. Mr. Mitch Joel is here. Hi, Mitch.
Bobby, how are you?
You know, several people have called out the fact that nobody should call you Bobby, and I'm like, Mitch can get away with it. He's about the only one I allow that from. And finally, my experiential marketing hero, the founder of New York-based agency Campfire, Mr. Mike Monello. Hi, Mike.
Good evening, Bob. Thanks for having me back on.
Always my pleasure to have you on the program. Well, let's jump into this first topic because this one has been top of mind. See what I did there? The forays in partnership with advocacy group Made of Millions have launched a campaign taking on the mental health of the industry with ads addressing managers directly in the voices of struggling employees. Now, campaign creative aside, Mitch, it's an okay campaign. I have my quibbles with it. But in your opinion, is our industry particularly bad at dealing with things like mental health issues? And is the agency world worse than most other businesses? What's your take on this whole stance that the industry is taking now about mental health in our business?
I mean, yes, and a hard yes. In fact, I was actually really surprised to see this news item come up as quote unquote news, only because for those who don't know, I'm Canadian. And up here in Canada, we have a long-standing B2B charity called NABS, which is the National Advertising Benevolent Society. And it is obviously a charitable organization that was set up for the advertising marketing industry. And I've been involved with it for many, many years, actually. In fact, I sat on the board of directors years ago. And what's interesting is it is there to support people who are in need of help, and it could be medical. And we've had instances where we've helped a family out when somebody within the industry came down with something as drastic as an ALS or an MS, and physical ailments. Someone gets cancer, someone passes away. But the vast majority of the services that this organization provides is mental health. There is Retrain Your Brain. There's actually like video and webinars. They have a program called LifeSpeak, and it is really driven towards the whole mental illness issue that we face in our business. And I mean, when you think about it, it seems pretty reasonable why. It is a fairly thankless job. When you do very well, especially on the agency side, the client gets all the credit, and when things go extremely bad, then the agency gets the blame. So on the agency side, it is problematic. It is a long-hour business. It is a creative business by its nature, and creative business typically attracts people who don't necessarily have mental health issues, but when you're super hyper creative, you fall on the spectrum of trying to get a good output out there. It's a business based off of very short deadlines, very critical feedback. Yeah, I mean, I think without a doubt, this is a massive problem. And again, I was really surprised to see this only sort of picking up steam or getting some form of recognition in the US now, where in Canada, I mean, this group of NABs, they come into agencies, they go into the brand site and speak directly to the marketers. They give out cards. There's basically help phone lines. So this is a subject, at least here in Canada, we've been talking about for well over 20 years.
Is it an independent organization in Canada? Is that something like?
Yeah.
So it's not part
It's
of like the
independent.
industry association or anything like along those lines.
No, it's independent, and I think it's one of the largest B2B charitable organizations, I think even in North America, not Canada. And they do things like ad auctions to raise more money. They offer services agency-wide. It's anonymous. I mean, it's quite embedded. They could always use more resources and help, obviously, but and they definitely struggle to meet budget and all that sort of stuff. But no, I mean, we've done lunch and learns back when I was in the agency world to inform the team. It's part of the HR services, actually.
Let me ask this question to the whole group. I mean, I don't want to leave behind that one question I asked Mitch, which is our industry worse than other industries? And I mean, yeah, and I'm not talking about all industries. I'm sure there are other industries that are not nearly as stressful. That's a given. But in the grand scheme of things, are we that much worse than the general high-pressure, business-oriented situation that most employees have to face on a daily basis? I mean, Mike, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are, and I think it's because advertising still sells hours rather than value. And so the system is really designed to exert that kind of pressure on employees. And, you look, managers are taught to value the spreadsheet above everything else and squeeze resources tighter. When I was in when my agency was part of a holding company, the mantra we were constantly hearing was do more with less from above. It was super unimaginative and super depressing. So yeah, it's pretty bad, and I think it's related to the fact that we're selling hours.
Now, Farrah, you and I are we're both independent, so we're not working directly in agencies, but we both have agency backgrounds. Your thoughts on this?
You can dump me in that bucket too now, but yes, I'll keep going. Farrah.
I still think of you as an agency guy, Mitch.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. One is I think about, early days in an agency, this is now going back almost 20 years, but an agency who had a policy that they would pay for you to go through drug or alcohol rehab twice. Like that was just part of the benefits of the agency. Suggested to me that was, well, it certainly suggested something to me about what might be going on inside the agency from a cultural perspective, or from the kinds of stress that people had in the way that they dealt with stress, and therefore the sense of obligation the agency had to its employees to help them with recovering from their attempt to cope with their own stress. I think the other thing is, having gone through my own experiences, I have ADHD. This is not usually much of a problem, but every once in a while you just find yourself in a kind of bad cultural fit where the way my brain works doesn't match up with the way my boss's brain works. And this is probably largely why I'm independent, actually, is that I don't have to do this sort of performance of work the way he or she might want it. I can just kind of get on with it and be productive on my own terms. So I think there's also that kind of, how do you conform to the culture if you're not, as they say, neuronormative? But I think there's kind of two separate issues. One is, I think it is fair to think that in a creative industry, it might draw people who are more sensitive or be less neuronormative or have other kinds of emotional and mental needs than other industries. I don't have the data on it, so I don't know how that really tracks. I think the degree to which this campaign is addressing the issue, it's looking at how agency life makes it worse. Right? It doesn't help, certainly.
Yeah, that's the one good thing about this campaign. It looks at it from the standpoint of it's not just the fact that the employee has a mental health issue. It's also the fact that you as a manager have to pay attention to this fact and recognize it and deal with it in a more constructive manner.
Exactly. And I think it treats it like it would any other kind of health condition. So, if it's fair for us to talk about, other health conditions or other issues that affect our ability to perform our work, and that we should be able to say to our bosses, we need an accommodation for that. This just kind of brings these types of issues into that same larger health bucket, which I think is a positive development. I think there's a flip side of it, though, and that is the way in which agencies actually can kind of cause these problems. It can cause anxiety or depression among people who might not have ever experienced that before, given the work culture, given the hours, given the pressures, given just cultural issues related to hierarchy and the myth of the les enfants terribles creative director, and all of these sorts of things. And they've been around forever. I mean, Mad Men to some degree both lionized and took down the hard drinking agency culture of the 60s that frankly still exists in a lot of places. So I think that is a separate issue. And then I think you've got another organization, sort of starting out as a blog and an Instagram account from Rob Campbell at RGA in London, that I think is called They Tried to Kill Me, But I Live, which is trying to address kind of corporate gaslighting, bad managers who make people feel like they're crazy because they are giving them bad feedback or undermining them every day, or not taking seriously their genuine concerns about other colleagues or about how their health issues are being addressed. And I think that's a separate thing from what this campaign's trying to do, but probably one that's at least as important for the industry to take on.
Well,
There's two sides of it. There are two sides. I really liked what Mike said, and I think that it's true. And I think the article even mentions this, which is as a former agency owner and then someone who was part of a very large machine being WPP. It's very clear that we operate lean. And I would always sort of laugh after you'd go into pitches and the client would say, if we were to give you our business tomorrow, would you be ready to go? And we're like, yeah, of course, we've got the team in place. And you sort of walk out and you're like, well, we're hiring. Like we're not keeping 6 people just on staff to hang out. And so when you're operating lean, and you're doing that when you're an entrepreneur, and you're definitely almost forced to do that, or there are certain issues that can come and arise when you're part of a holding company that make the sort of operation of it more stressful. It means that people are usually bearing a larger burden of work. On the brand side too, right? What's the first thing that goes when things aren't great? Advertising and marketing is the first thing that goes. Now, if you're an employee sitting in the middle, do I go agency or do I go brand? Those two tropes, which are real and they're part of this business, it's hard. I mean, you are in work always thinking, when's the other shoe going to drop? And I don't care who you are. Over time, it's debilitating, no matter how good of a run you have as an agency and no matter how good of a run you have as a brand. It just doesn't last. And I think it becomes systematic to problems of mental health, but it becomes also systematic at a broader extent, which is just a greater HR issue of how long people stay at work, how loyal they feel to their team, et cetera, et cetera. So it is an industry in and of itself that fosters it by its very existence.
One of the things that I'm kind of wrestling with this campaign is that it's just about awareness, and it's about making managers aware of this situation. And I'm wondering how much effectiveness can we really expect from a campaign like that without backing it up with some serious management training? It seems like management training is where the emphasis needs to be, not an ad campaign.
I mean, that was actually my sadness when I started digging in, because I just made maybe the stupid assumption that if we have it in Canada, clearly it was actually done because it was done in the States before, because that's a typical move by Canadians. So to have something like this without an anonymous helpline, without a sort of direct path to potentially speak to someone in HR or actually get help from a professional, I don't understand what you do with this information. I don't understand what awareness without action does. It's literally like doing, and I'm taking it to an extreme, but some form of, suicide prevention awareness without a net underneath it.
Mike, have you ever seen anything like that in the business? I mean, like a serious management training on mental health issues. I mean, you've been around the block here for a while. Have you ever seen or experienced anything like that?
No, not even lip service to it, to be honest.
Oh, we got to move you guys up here to Canada. This is crazy.
It really is. As you were talking, I just kind of was hoping that was something that we might eventually see. I mean, I think it's a particularly big issue in the United States in general. Just, I think as a country, we have a problem talking about mental health. It seems to be moving in the right direction, but it's still happening slowly. I mean, the other issue is that I'm not even sure. I mean, managers, okay, but I feel like this is an issue that has to be addressed higher up because the managers are under pressure to squeeze resources, as I was saying, and so I think ultimately incentives are skewed, and it feels like you look at. I think this relates to a lot of things when you look at the brain drain that happens in our industry as well. I think a lot of people are leaving the industry, and a big reason for that is the work-life balance. You can go into various advertising communities online and you see work-life balance when people are asking about agencies and, is this agency worth going to? One of the first questions out of their mouths is, how's the work-life balance? So it's becoming a bigger issue, particularly with, I think, younger employees. So we might see a shift as a result of the need to attract the right employees.
And I think it's fair to also, to be honest, criticize this campaign, because the biggest problem with mental health and the stigma around it is that it looks like a weakness. If I have a social anxiety, if I deal with some form of depression, et cetera, it is seen as stigma, unfortunately, is that it's seen as a weakness. And I don't feel like this campaign did anything to diminish that or make it be, which it is, more medical potentially. And my vibe from reading it was, it feels like almost the culling of the flock, like it actually went directly into the stigma of weakness. I didn't read it and go, I feel now sensitive to the people who are saying it. I felt more like they're not going to make it in this industry. And that's the exact problem of the mental health stigma. Can't have that. It's a medical problem. You break your arm and your manager says you can't show up to work. You can't type one-handed. But if there's something wrong inside your brain, we're like, don't be weak. And unfortunately, I don't think this campaign broke that stigma at all.
One last question about this. Farrah, I'd love your thoughts on the whole idea of mitigating this problem in a flagrantly workaholic industry. I mean, is there any way to do that? I mean, with that much pressure on top of a person, in addition to any mental health issues, it doesn't seem like there is any way to solve this problem within our business.
Well, I think that's probably fair. Like at a very basic level, if we can't figure out a way to work differently, then we're inevitably going to have people who need to work differently, whether they have mental health issues or not, will continue to leave the industry. I think the some of the things that they're nibbling at in this campaign, though, are super relatable. The kind of, look, I'm not going to look happy in every meeting. It doesn't mean I'm not engaged. A little bit, that's sort of the hey baby smile, tone policing kind of thing that women get all the time, but also something that, if you appear to be having a bad day, that somehow brings down the vibe in the room. And I think there are some places around the edges where we can all just give each other a little bit of a break, and it might help for a while. But until we get to a place where we can figure out how to do this work so that it's not, my last agency experience, I was in meetings from 9 until 5. Then I got to work. And that was ridiculous. Most of the meetings I was in, I shouldn't have been in. Most of the meetings I was in, I would get yelled at by the PM later for having been in because we weren't budgeted to have the group planning director in the meeting. But that was the culture of the business. Everybody had to be in every freaking meeting. This sort of expectation of you can do your work at night turns women away. It turns people who have elderly parents or children to take care of away. It turns people who have physical disabilities away. It turns people who have mental health issues away. None of this is good for the business. It's also not good for the broader culture. But there's a lot that's structural that has to be dealt with. This sort of nibbles at some of the edges and might ease some of it for some people a little bit every day. And that's a heck of a lot, frankly, for the person who's going through it. But it's really, really not enough.
Well, I'm going to move on in just a minute and talk a little bit more on this subject, talking about alternative agency networks and how clients and agency people are moving toward a different model instead of the holding company model. We'll get to that in just a minute. But first, I am super excited to tell you about this week's sponsor, because Rev is the very first transcription service I ever used in this business. We're talking about like way before I even started this show. I was relying on Rev for fast, quality transcription. And I am so pleased that they've decided to use the BeanCast to promote this wonderful product. So having a good quality transcription service is not a luxury anymore. It's a necessity. Think about it. Think about how many times you use audio recordings. I mean, more and more we're relying on audio recordings so that we don't miss anything, those important nuggets of information. Everything from focus group recordings to using your smartphone to record a conference keynote. Well, Rev is your ticket to making all that valuable data accessible and, more importantly, searchable, and they'll do it all in less than 12 hours. That's from submission to final submission from them to you. And look, whether you have a transcription service already or have never used one, all they want you to do is give them a try. So right now, when you go to rev.com/blog/BeanCast, that's rev.com/blog/BeanCast, they're going to take $10 off your first order and give you a chance to see what an amazing service Rev is for the average advertising executive. See for yourself what Rev's speed and accuracy can do for you. That's rev.com/blog/BeanCast for your $10 discount, and we thank them very much for their support of the show. Well, it used to be that the path of most independent agencies was to grow until you caught the attention of a holding company who would eventually just buy you. And the only way large clients could achieve global reach was to work with these giant behemoths of advertising greatness. But now players like Ninth Wonder, Plan A, Worldwide Partners, they're challenging this model by banding together independent agencies to provide global reach while maintaining the independent feel when dealing with clients directly. So, Mike, let's talk about this model. Does it make sense, or do you see problems? What's your immediate take on this new trend that's going on in the advertising world?
Well, so does the model make sense, or do I see problems? The answer is yes. But look, having lived through the acquisition of my own company by an independent global agency, and then almost immediately after the acquisition of that global agency by a major holding company, these kinds of alternate structures are really appealing, I think, for agency owners and I think their clients. Because from my experience, the holding companies, they don't really get or value the culture of their acquisitions, and that has an enormous effect on the work. All they really tend to do is they destroy the culture. They add crushing processes and overhead without really adding value. I think there's a reason why every time there's another holding company consolidation, no one celebrates the new Frankenstein monster. We kind of mourn what we know as the loss of the former agencies and what made them special. So the idea of incentivizing agencies to partner through ownership rather than trying to force the collaboration through networks and consolidation makes a lot of sense. But I think these models are more effective when there aren't a lot of competing agencies in the group. So, some of these structures you're sharing account services and business development. And I think once you have, say, 2 social agencies or multiple creative agencies in the group working through those centralized processes, you're going to start to have competition, I think, which may affect collaboration. So I do think the idea of a partnership is the right model, but I don't think they're a panacea. I think it requires more than just senior leadership buy-in in this case. The employees of each agency have to be invested in it. And I think those kinds of relationships tend to be forged over time in multiple projects. So I think it's a kind of an ongoing process that has to be worked at.
I thought it was one of the more absurd articles and self-serving to obviously the people who are claiming that it's a solution. It is exactly the antithesis of the situation we currently find ourselves in. If there is a push away from mass global agencies or holding companies, it's simply because the need isn't there. But if you truly need that type of global reach and scale, there is no chance you're going to convince me, as someone who spent 20 years in the foxholes of literally a 2-person shop to eventually being acquired by WPP and then turning that into a global agency that was operating in 30 countries, that you're going to tell me that this model works. It doesn't work. In fact, the lack of a consistent team, or a team that really operates together, has operated together in previous incantations at that type of scale, makes it a complete impossibility. And I can tell you just personally that if given the choice to sit down with a client and talk about global expansion, I would rather talk to them about building out a consistent team, freelance team, to get there if they were comparing us to a real, ensconced global player. It is impossible, especially in these network models, to sell someone else's wares. That you want us here, but in Italy there's this agency and they have this one. There really is very little interaction between those agencies, if at all. And the sort of silliness of this article, that the reason this works is because in the holding companies are all fighting for their own P&L, is ridiculous. Because if you're an independent agency within one of these sort of network things, you're still fighting for your P&L too. You're not going to go, oh, that $1 million piece of business. No, you should have that. Really, it's over to you. It was absolutely crazy. And then the other thing that I can tell you, having been on the inside of WPP and having friends in the Publicis network and Havas and on, is that there is a large misnomer in this industry, and it always frustrated me, which is that WPP isn't one big global agency. In fact, if you actually look at it, it's mostly filled with a bunch of indie agencies that were acquired and had specialized skills. And a WPP or a Publicis or whoever else, an IPG's ability to say, oh, you have a specific CRM need here, but a global advertising need over here, or there is nobody better positioned, and I'm including the major consulting firms now, or anybody, to service a client that has specific needs globally that might be very verticalized within each region than the holding companies at this point. And to stand there and say, well, this outsourcing of BD and client services is even more absurd. You need those connective tissues between your teams for them to truly perform for the client, because ultimately the performance is not just in the work, but it comes from over time knowing the client and knowing the work, and that's where the actual saving of revenue happens over time. So I just looked at the whole thing and thought that it was really, such a, it's like when a Midwestern independent agency has an article in Adweek that says, Midwestern independent agencies are the future of the agency business. No kidding.
Well, yeah, I can see the weakness in the model right from the start. I mean, when you're saying you have global reach, you're really trying to communicate to the client that you're able to have a unified voice across all your different operating regions. And that doesn't seem to be part and parcel of the construction of these networks. It's more about independence being harnessed together so that you have office resources, or you have an advertising resources in the different markets that you need to operate in. But it doesn't really ensure a unified voice across the global operating region. So that's problematic.
One thing I would say, though, having worked both on international campaigns as the research company, where the holding company and the major agencies within it were holding forth about this international network capability, that's a load of bollocks too. I mean, all of those agencies are not on the same P&L. They are also competing with one another. They are not perfectly aligned. They do not do a good job of briefing out to their agencies in region or in country what the underlying, desire of the client might be. There are politics about the people running the brand team at the local geos on the client side, having back channel conversations with the agencies in market. I mean, it's a mess. I was going to say something profane, but I remember I'm not supposed to do that here.
Thank you very much. It's Game of Thrones tonight. We don't want to mess with that.
This model doesn't solve that. And it's exactly
this model makes it worse. It's more spaghetti.
Well, it certainly doesn't make it any better. And because they're all competing for P&L, and the idea that, well, we'll have all these specialist agencies is also very cute. When I was at Digitas, our partners at the media agency were pitching creative. The idea that we'll be specialists is ridiculous. Nobody's specialist anymore. This is part of why you now have Wonderman, Thompson, Frankenstein, and Digitas, LBI, whatever. Like all of these things kind of coming together are about trying to figure out how to scale this business when it's always been hard and it just keeps getting harder. And it's because of the hours model. It's because of downward pressure from procurement. It's a kind of a dog of a model, to be honest. But if you can keep it humming at a particular level of scale and just keep eking out those efficiencies where you can survive another 10 years, seems to be the way it's going. The only thing that's interesting to me about these networks is, what are their real goals and aspirations? How big do they want to get? Because if the intention of the networks and the member companies, many of them, and at least according to this article, seem to have equity stakes in the network writ large, is just to get to the place where you're not terrified that you're not going to make payroll this month, then that could be interesting. That kind of cooperative model that allows mid-sized agencies to be mid-sized agencies and to find some kind of efficiency through a shared back office or a shared account management function could be an interesting experiment, but I am not super
But
optimistic.
that's
I love two things. One is the model is very fear based too, because you're right, Farrah. Like the issue is that suddenly these agencies are in this awkward position, and we were there too as an independent, where you're too big to really play in the smaller leagues and to work on those budgets, and you're too small to go after those bigger accounts. And this maybe positions you better to sort of take that deep breath and have the ability to at least reach out to these other quote unquote partners. That doesn't mean it creates a good result for the clients. And while I'm not pushing back on anything you said, Farrah, I'm just sort of going in a different direction, which is true. But if you have to launch a truly global campaign, there are a handful that we know that operate globally. And it's true, they operate the way you said, but they still have operated similarly that way. So whether it is an Ogilvy or now a Wunderman Thompson, I mean, they do and have, McCann, they've done global campaigns. They work that way. They've operated that way versus let's hope that this independent that's like me over in Europe, over in Asia, over in wherever actually can do this because we don't know. And then we all share revenue if it works out. That is not good for the client. That's when the money starts really being spent because you're burning hours trying to figure out how to work together.
Now, Mike, you had something you were going to say?
Well, I was going to say, my reading of the article is not that all of these agencies were just agreeing to collaborate, but that they actually have ownership in, I guess, the holding company model, which is a little different than an acquisition-based model where, you're acquired and now you're forced to work with partners who you may not get on with. I think in this case, it was up to the individual agencies whether they join in or not. I agree generally, like when they're talking about global reach, it's a lot less successful. I think from my eyes, I look at, and I'm playing from my experience, Campfire's always been project-based. So we've always been able to jump into a situation with a client, get to know the business, and contribute our specialization. And it does feel to me like, we've been able to survive because we specialize. We do very, very well at what we do. And we do it better than all the agencies that claim they do it, but do a zillion other things. And so our clients will come to us and peel away the money for us to come work with them. And that's worked. But there have been times when we have actually reached out to other agencies that do things we don't. And we have forged these partnerships just organically out of need. And they've worked out pretty well when both agencies are invested and we're not competing. And I think when I look at some of these networks, I can see how that kind of structure might work a lot better than when the holding companies try to buy these more specialized agencies and then mash them into their larger offerings.
But I don't agree, Mike, because what happens there is the exact problem, which is the redundancy of work. You have both companies need to have a client services, both companies need to have accounting. It creates so much work for the client, not so much work, but so much more revenue the client's paying for. I mean, there really is that infrastructure that doesn't work. I've seen these independent networks. We've been offered to be a part of them. We've worked on partnership models. Whenever we look at it, it's like if you don't have one agency really leading it and just pulling the resources and managing it tightly, you are blowing budget constantly. It is never a winner financially. So look, and I get it. I'm going hard on into this, and it freaks me out. And I'm sure that people are probably screaming listening to this now, and I get it. But I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've followed it, and I've seen it. And whenever I see these articles, I'm more with Farrah, where it feels like this desperate plea of we're not just small and boutique, but we're also not this big holding company. But if you need global, you kind of need global.
Well, let me ask you a question about that, because it seems to me like the obvious next step for any one of these networks is to become a holding company. So is this really just a first step toward another holding company model?
Well, that's what it looked like to me. I mean, I think the other question I have is, at what point does one of the founding larger of the smalls decide that a richer beau has come calling, and they might like to go get married to him. Like, at what point does somebody get an offer from WPP or Omnicom or whomever and say, "This is my chance to retire in 5 years"? And how do they extract themselves from these not really a holding company networks? How do they not start to look for the same kinds of equities and efficiencies of an actual formalized holding company? And then, put my law school hat back on. It's also kind of like, aren't they just functionally, actually, on paper, holding companies? Like, isn't that
that's
really what we're talking about?
Yeah, this is like the whole disruption conversation that also, like, I always laugh at. It's like, Uber's the largest car company and they own no cars, Tom Goodwin, but the truth is he's changed that to Uber actually buys a lot of cars, and that's what happens all the time. Martin Sorrell, Morris Levy, these are very smart individuals. You don't have to like them, but they were very smart individuals, and they built this model over decades, and they refined it over decades. Some might say it's been hollowing out over decades, or money grab over decades, or public markets. Fine. But the model did create a level of efficiency and revenue and profit for it. And to think like, oh, we're going to be like four sort of mid-sized agencies and we're going to figure out a bet, like, no, you're not. Because going back to what Mike said, we have a very simple business model here. We get paid for a human unit of time more money than we charge. Or we charge more money for a human unit of time more than we pay for it. That's the revenue model.
Well, I want to move on and talk next about the evolving feelings about brands among consumers. As little as 5 years ago, the dominant feeling about brands was that they represented utility and little more, leading to a lot of soul searching among brand managers about what the proper tactic was to take, and the belly aching that perhaps consumers just didn't care about brands anymore. But now, in a survey by Momentum, and again, we always take surveys with a grain of salt, we see that consumer sentiment has evolved, and they now see the best brands as being inspirational. So, Mitch, can the marketers of the world take credit for moving opinion on this, or is there a bigger cultural movement afoot that values brands more than it did 5 years ago? What are your takes?
I think it's actual product shift or service shift is what I think is going on here. And if you look at what's behind the direct to consumer revolution, I would make the argument, at least, that these are brands that have a sense of purpose. They use a very strong sense of storytelling. I hope Mike will agree with me on that. They create a better consumer experience. I no longer have to go down and grapple with the alarm blaring razor blade thing when I can just pay a small monthly fee and have them show up every other month in my house. They create a sense of the infinite aisle. There's constant inventory and there's stuff you need. They leverage content as media. They're building direct relationships with their actual consumers and speaking to them through newsletters and content and other things. So I think on one, that sort of direct to consumer becoming more prevalent has shifted that momentum in a very, very powerful way. I also think none of us would argue that we're all using that saying that people don't buy things, they buy experiences. So if you layer all those things in, the fact that these businesses now have more first-party data, they can move a little bit faster, they can speak to specific niches, I think it's actually quite clear and obvious why that shift has taken place, and I think why it's going to push even further as the world evolves.
Mike, Mitch referenced you a little bit. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree 100%. It absolutely is the kind of experience economy effect here. I also think with regard to this specific survey, which was, of course, done by an experiential agency, but I do think there is a cultural trend towards optimism right now that's just happening. And so I think some of that is bleeding into the world. I mean, if you look at pop culture, we're starting to want stories that are a lot more uplifting, and we're seeing a little bit of a downtrend on more dystopian stories. So I think it's not a surprise that the end game here of Game of Thrones, probably one of the most dystopian shows of all time, but coming around to an end, we're starting to see the Rally is more popular. But so I do think there is a cultural trend, but overall, I would absolutely agree. This has to do with the focus on the total experience for the customer and acknowledging that We don't just make decisions rationally, and we don't just make decisions emotionally. It's a complex web, and I think brands and particularly services are getting much better at addressing that.
Let me ask this question. I mean, how should marketers respond? I mean, obviously we have something going on in the marketplace, and does this mean that we always have to have a brand that is an inspiration to society? Is that the new trend that we need to embrace, or is there something a little bit more reasonable to do in the meantime? Your thoughts, Farrah?
Yeah, I mean, I as always, I am in the as always camp. This feels a little bit, well, I mean, there's a couple of things. One, this is a survey conducted by an experiential advertising agency. They might have a vested interest in proving that experiential advertising is better than other kinds of advertising. So we'll just park that out there. I don't think that they're wrong. I think, experiential advertising is better than purely utility-driven advertising, particularly in categories where you've got a lot of parity between products. You've got to stand out somehow and create some kind of, salience and involvement that people can experience for themselves. I think the other side of it, though, is just to say, doesn't this just sort of feel like the wave that was about participation in 2006, 7, 8, around the birth of the iPhone? Doesn't this feel like a return to the kind of, advertising as, objects of culture and creators of movements from sometime in the 90s? Like there's a degree to which I think we go in these cycles. And I think sometimes the agencies lead on that by creating experiences and campaigns that really leverage that, and people really want it. I think we then go into these other cycles where totally new categories get built, and being kind of functional and utilitarian makes sense because we're just trying to explain to people what something like an Uber is. But once you've got Uber and Lyft and Juno and everything else, you might want to start differentiating yourself on some other measure. And that's where these experiential, participatory, emotional, movement-like campaigns can start to, move the needle for brands. So do all brands need to do it? No, that's the same problem we've had every other time. Everybody is not going to have an intimate relationship with the consumer. Sometimes you're just the mailman. You drop stuff off for me and you leave, and we don't know each other, right?
Yeah, but a lot of times, Farrah, what's happening because of this shifting ability to deliver so directly to consumers is that it's less about, do I need a relationship with my razor blade company? No. Do I love the fact that comparatively to how I used to buy these things, this is so much easier, so much more reasonable. There's a bit more humor in it. They're offering new product extensions. They're making my life easier. I'd say, yeah. And even things as innocuous as notebooks. I'm a big notebook nerd. I think about the way Moleskine communicates to me, or a Field Notes, and it is somewhat inspirational. Like a piece of paper is a piece of paper. And yet when those notebooks arrive and I crack one open, I want to write, and I want to write something important, and I want to use a better pen all of a sudden. So I think I don't want to dismiss what you're saying. I think it's incredibly powerful and true. But I do think that culturally, we've seen this shift in not just the product or service, but how it's packaged and delivered that has made people feel more attached to brands than ever before. And I think that that's a thing that exists over and above what a marketing message is. That's more where I was trying to go.
And I completely agree. I think the trick is not all businesses are set up to deliver that way, and
Right.
not all businesses will pull it off. And then there is also the problem of, on a longer tail, a lot of the businesses who do that well now will cease to do it well. And so that, while it is true, and I completely get it, I'm a huge Quip fan, right? Like, I love that freaking toothbrush. It's just a toothbrush. And the second that something breaks down in that service experience, or the second that they start taking themselves more seriously, then that sense of attachment that I have right now will erode. It's not the sort of thing that just sort of gets locked in. And this is the thing that I see clients over and over and over again want, is this kind of like, if we just write cute copy, or we have sort of cartoony symbols on the page, or we figure out a way to do direct to consumer service experiences, then they will love us forever. And that's the trap that I see brand managers get into.
What it comes down
it's
to,
not forever. It's for
about,
now.
It's about
Well,
it's about commitment. It's about commitment. It's the same thing I say about podcasts. People can start a podcast, but if you're not willing to commit to the audience in the same way that the audience is committing to you, you're in a losing position.
Exactly.
And it's the same with the brand. Mike, you were going to say something?
Well, yeah, look, if I were to get tactical here and just talk about advertising, because I agree that obviously the experience and the products all are paramount here. But if we get tactical, I think this idea of utility versus inspiration is kind of bogus. It's really about the mix, and it has to do with what you're doing. So if you're a brand and you're investing money in something experiential, you better be focusing on evoking an emotional response out of that experience, because there's literally nothing less interesting in the world than a utilitarian experience. But a mobile ad offering me a discount while I'm standing in front of a coffee shop, it doesn't need to inspire me to go to song and dance. So it's really about, I think, how you're playing this in your mix and where you're focusing your attention. I believe it or not, I've had clients who talk about wanting to do an experiential activation, but they're not interested in actually conveying the story that experiential is best at conveying. So I think on a very tactical level, it just has to do with really letting each channel, I guess, do what it does best and making sure you're hitting the right mix.
Well, I want to move on to the last topic because we're running out of time. Just do this real briefly. Apple's original intelligent tracking prevention was broken pretty quickly by the Googles of the world. Google and Facebook quickly found workarounds, putting off the end of programmatic for at least a little while. So, of course, Apple is updating its software now. But instead of simply blocking the workaround, they did something pretty interesting. They allowed them to still work these workarounds, but made sure that they don't go beyond simple targeting and that they stray into actual tracking. So they're doing their job more effectively. They're preventing the tracking, but they're still allowing some targeting through workarounds. Farrah, what do you think of this move, and how will it impact the digital ad business?
Well, so at a top line level, Safari is less than 5% or something of the desktop browser market.
Absolutely.
They're like a quarter of the mobile browser market. So how much of an impact? Some, probably not as much impact as DoubleClick's changes to their own terms after GDPR came down.
Exactly.
But I think there's a bigger issue here, which is there is still what they've really done is time boxed it. We'll track it for 24 hours and then we delete the cookie. And after the 24 hours, whatever attribution towards an actual sale or a conversion of some other kind, it kind of evaporates into the ether. I think Apple continues to sort of have its stance of wanting to protect privacy for a variety of reasons, not all of them altruistic. And obviously Google and Facebook and others still have an incentive to try to figure out how to get around it. I think the interesting thing is looking at brands saying, well, if we can't get the attribution and the tracking and the targeting that we want from you, we might start going elsewhere. And that is fascinating because elsewhere probably means more waste, more fraud, and certainly more PR nightmares as we discover that these other places to get programmatic that do those things better aren't in compliance with the current regulatory framework of GDPR, aren't going to be in compliance with the tweaks that are made to that over time, and the new regulation that will no doubt be coming from the United States government as well. Like, we're just moving into an era now here where we've got to figure out the balance between what brands and their agencies want to accomplish in selling work to their clients and what users expect and should reasonably expect in terms of their data privacy. And that, to me, is like, this is the real moment. This is the real fight. And it's not just about Apple. Everybody is implicated in this in one way or another.
People think that I'm ranting a lot because I'm no longer in the agency business, and the
You
truth
go,
is,
Mitch, you
I
go.
I was outspoken, long before that. And so when I see stuff like this, and I think Farrah broke down the tech sort of component of it in a really proper way, I came at this from another angle. Angle one was brands are pigs. How much more data do these people need to figure? I mean, how much more targeting? How much more information? If you just go to Google and Facebook and do your proper targeting, basic, and you can't sell on that, change the product. There's a problem, or just deal with the discernible market that you've been giving.
Yep,
the
amen.
other problem here is that MarTech is just purely there to push their own growth and their own market capitalization. So any chance they get to add on more link decoration or more cross-site tracking, they'll do, because why not? Because it's something else for them to say in some stupid PowerPoint deck that might get them the acquisition they need for their own exit. And agencies who are always stuck in the middle, going back to the first topic we talked about, where if they do something great, the client takes all the credit, and if they do something bad, it's all on them, or something bad happens, it's all on them, is that all of this data just simply goes, look, here's all the information you need. Like maybe your product or service doesn't really work in the market. And that's what's going on here. If you can't sell a consumer with what you currently have in the digital world that we have, cut out all of that link decoration, you suck, or there's just not a market for what you do.
Preach.
Well, with that, it's time for the Ad Fail 5. But before we get to that segment of the show, I do want to take this quick opportunity to thank my guests again and allow them to each do their shameless plug, starting with Farrah Bostic. You can find her at thedifferenceengine.co. That's the home of her consultancy. Tell us what's going on in your world, Farrah. What would you like to promote?
We are about to launch a newsletter, actually, for this civic engagement project I've been incubating for about a year now. And it's called First Person Project, and it'll be hosted on Substack. And so if you follow me on Twitter, you will be hearing about it in the coming days.
And we do follow you on Twitter, so we will be on the lookout for that.
Excellent.
Next up, Mitch Joel. You can find him at 6pixels.com. That's the home of his blog. That's the home of his podcasts. And yes, plural on podcasts, all kinds of stuff going on over there. You can get his book. Tell us what's going on in your world, Mitch. What would you like to promote?
I think you just did. Thanks, Bob. Head over to 6pixels.com. I'm happy to share some content and thinking over there, or head over to mitchjoel.com. If you're running an event and want somebody to come up on stage and yell at your audience, I'd probably be a good guy to do that.
Yeah, Mitch is great to see on stage. He does a really, really great dog and pony, so you definitely want to see that. And last but not least, Mike Monello. CampfireNYC.com is the place where you go to find the best experiential agency that I've ever seen. So tell us what's going on in your world, Mike. What would you like to promote?
Thank you, Bob. We're cranking away. So yeah, CampfireNYC.com, as you said. Thank you very much. And then on the personal side, late last year, I did a horror podcast, first one for AMC Shudder, called Video Palace. So it's a fictional scripted podcast, and we've gotten incredible response. We're starting to think about the next chapter in that story. So if you didn't catch the first one, go check it out.
Yeah, that's done gangbusters. I mean, people are in love with that podcast. So, congratulations on that. As for me, for more information about me or the show, visit thebeancast.com. There you can find a complete show archive. You can find out how to consult with me. You can even find out how to advertise on the program. So check it all out at thebeancast.com. And now it's time for the Ad Fail 5, a rundown of the lowest moments in advertising, marketing, and public relations from the last week. And first up, you may have heard over the last few years that China is a hotbed for bike sharing, Farrah. Well, as the New York Times points out, that bubble has burst, leaving one factory town that was building most of the things for the entire country literally covered with rusting abandoned bikes. Some of the pictures from this scene are just absolutely incredible. Did you check out the article? Did you see those pictures?
I did. It was starting to look like some of those neighborhoods in LA and DC with all the scooters.
It was like marketing gone amok. Well, next up, BuzzFeed has shown us that Amazon sellers are paying third parties as much as $10,000 to game the system, Mitch, in order to get better rankings on the site. Sounds really, really familiar. Can we say SEO? It sounds like they're just gaming the system the way SEO has always gamed it.
AEO, AEM, there you go.
Now, next up, it's been a couple weeks since the launch of the supposedly revolutionary podcast platform Luminary. Oh, man, Mike, it's become a case study on how not to launch a product. I mean, from the start, they didn't have all the people that they wanted on the show. And then I had everybody starting to jump ship as soon as they found out that they weren't doing things directly to the server in terms of serving the podcast. They were going through a proxy server, which was totally screwing with everybody's numbers. Nobody knew how many people were downloading and had no information on their customers anymore.
Yeah, this launch is going to make a hell of a season of Silicon Valley. I can't wait.
In our Facebook fail of the week, even though the company eliminated the accounts of extremists and conspiracy fearmongers, for some reason, Farrah, they decided to make it a PR story before they actually turned off the accounts. Thus, they ended up affording all of these individuals enough time to marshal their audiences on the platforms before the access was cut. This is like such a bonehead move.
Yeah, or it isn't. Or it's exactly what they intended to do. It buys them, some credibility in saying, no, guys, there's no conspiracy against you. And it bought the president time to figure out how to essentially retweet and repost from Alex Jones. So, doing his duty.
And last but not least, I love this one. Chase Bank got a little too clever on Twitter this last week, Mike, seemingly blaming low account balances on poor financial decisions, which is really rich coming from a bank that took a $25 billion bailout because of their own bad decision making. This is just like classic 101 social media manager misstep.
Oh, it's so bad. How am I going to trust Chase with my money when they can't even meme right? I mean, really.
Delete your account.
Well, have something to add to this list or just want to discuss it? Comment online. Use the hashtag #AdFail5. That's pound, AdFail, and the number 5. Well, that does it for this week's show. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, visit our website at thebeancast.com and click on the subscribe link. If you're an Apple Podcast listener, we've also provided a direct link to our listing there, or just search for the BeanCast in the podcast directory on the Apple Podcasts app. And whichever podcast directory you use, when you subscribe, please leave us a review. Got a comment? Have a question? We'd love to hear from you. Just send your emails to beancast@gmail.com. Opening theme was performed by Joe Seibel. Closing theme by C. Jax. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Norp. We'll be back again next week. Hope you'll join us then.
It's like, you know what I mean? It's like if it's, you know what I mean? I don't know, man. Just like, okay, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like totally like that. It's like, I don't know, like if it's, it's like, you know what I mean? Yeah, it's just like kind of, it just seems like it's just like almost exactly. It's like exactly. Yeah. You know what I mean? Exactly.
Cool beans.